Once I was back in Spain, I realised how absolutely wonderful it was to be back in my own home with my family, with my dogs. It was lovely. I could relax, I could have some time to myself. And although I was at a geographical distance from Dad, I spoke to him every day. We still had our daily chats. I reassured him that I would be back as soon as I could visit him again, and he reassured me that all would be well. Everything was fine, and he was being well looked after. So that's the way it was. I also realised that finally I could stop and grieve for Mum. I could start grieving for Mum. Lockdown in Spain was very strict. It was like Italy. We were under house arrest. So our guidelines from the government were that one person from each household could shop once a week at their nearest supermarket. So I nominated myself to be the one person in our household. I would drive to the supermarket, well, once or twice a week, and I actually went to the supermarket I wanted to because I didn't like the supermarket that was closest to my home. So arriving at the supermarket, well, no, I should say on the way to the supermarket, every time I was stopped by the police who were on our local roundabout and I was interrogated. The police stood there with a machine gun in balaclavas, nothing friendly, not how are you coping, just where have you come from, where are you going, what are you doing? And if I was stopped on the way back from the supermarket, they would often ask me to get out of my car, open my boot, and show them my shopping. It was very severe. It was unpleasant. It was intimidating. At the supermarket, when you went in, you had to use hand sanitizer. Then, with your hand sanitizer on, you had to put gloves on. And if you paused going around the supermarket, you were yelled at to keep going. Couldn't speak to anybody. So that was the supermarket run. Often at the end of it, I would phone my daughter and tell her that I was going to drive back via her road, and would she come out onto the balcony of their flat with the children so at least I could see them. And that's what we did. And I actually never got stopped going home on one of those trips. So that was quite lucky. I never had to explain myself to the police. Another of the rules was that we could walk from our homes 1 kilometre as long as we had a dog. So I'm not quite sure why we were less likely to catch COVID out in the fresh air walking with our dog than without a dog. Anyway, some of the rules started to seem quite ridiculous and we started to question everything. Oh, and by the way, fairly amusing, I suppose, a lot of people started sharing dogs so that, some people didn't have an outside space. They needed to get out into the fresh air. So they borrowed each other's dogs. That was another rule. Another thing was that the younger children were not allowed out of their homes for 7 weeks. So, again, for children who lived in apartments and had no outside space, just imagine what a terrible restriction. After the 7 weeks, all these pasty faced children came out, my daughter and her children being one of those families, and they walked down to the beach and they sat on the pebble beach in our beautiful port of Javier. And they told me that there were other mothers and children down there that day. And of course, the children were very excited. They hadn't been out of their homes for 7 weeks. And of course, they wanted to rush down to the sea and paddle. But the police came down onto the beach amongst these mothers and children with their machine guns and told the mothers to get the children out of the water. The children weren't allowed in the water, so I'm not quite sure what they thought the sea was going to do to these children paddling. One child apparently ran back into the water, and one of the policemen came down again with his machine gun, marched through the beach, and marched this mother and child off the beach. Well, That's quite traumatic, isn't it, for the children? Quite traumatic. After that happened, that was pretty much the final straw for me. As a family, we'd had lots of conversations during the time about what we thought was going on, about the restrictions, the ones that made sense, the ones that made no sense whatsoever. And as I said, we started to question everything. So during that time, we'd come to the very difficult decision that we actually didn't want to be in Spain anymore. I felt very strongly that I wanted to get back to my home country. We didn't think this was going to be over anytime soon. And so we made that plan. We started making plans to leave. On the 7th of June 2020, my daughter and I, with my grandchildren, took a flight from Barcelona. Joe, my youngest son, drove us to Valencia train station. Our local airports were closed, Valencia and Alicante. All the planes were parked up there, they weren't going anywhere. But Barcelona was still flying. So we took a train from Valencia to Barcelona. I was very worried about Joe, that he would get stopped and interrogated by the police on his way home, but he didn't. We got to Barcelona, the airport was deserted. Because we were so early, we didn't want to go through to the departure lounge straight away because we wanted to have some space with the children. We had hours to wait. And there was no one there. There was no one at all. We sat near a vending machine, and all I could see was a line of Guardia Civil vans at the end of the airport. Finally, we went through into the departure lounge and it was packed. We boarded our plane and it was packed. I spoke to the crew who told me that they'd been flying twice daily between Barcelona and London Heathrow throughout lockdown. So the reports we were hearing on the news of all airports being closed, we couldn't travel anywhere, it wasn't true. As we now know, people were traveling across the world throughout lockdown. And many people have many different opinions on that. So there we were on our flight back to England.